especially with, you know, sort of a pandemic that we haven't gotten. So welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to be here, and I think so. My presentation is going to be, on the one hand, it's going to be very different from yours, Charles. But I think that just picking up the last question around the blanket being too short, and what's the solution? And so to me, and I have no stake in this, but the solution is in solidarity. And I think that's where there's this book which just completely inspired me. There's these moments, you know, where we just start going into from hope into despair. And there's moments where you think, all this, you know, everything seems so broken and so difficult. And so Leah Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor wrote a book. It came out this year. And to me, it gave me hope. And I think it gave me hope around how actually the blanket is not too short, is what they're arguing. The blanket is too short because of capitalism. And so their idea is not just it's not a bad idea, but it's a world-changing idea. And I think that's where sort of they're organized, it's about organizing. And I think that's why we're all in this room. That's why we're all so motivated by this conference. Because yes, it was, you know, one of those things that was sort of like inclusivity and the inclusive museum. What do we mean by that at the time when UMR were already seeing this vision? But I think it's one of those things that we all struggle with, right? As museums, I'm the director of a museum. I've worked for many, many years in museums now. Is how do we actually, if we can see that change is needed, do we know where it needs to go? Probably not. So is there the only way maybe to actually see how it could change is by being in contact with lots of other communities, lots of our local communities, our global communities, and doing that sort of work around intersectionality. I'm going to go quite big first in sort of, and maybe negative in naming some of the crises that, you know, sort of also the World Economic Forum and others are seeing that they're coming at us. And then I'm going to be going quite small because all the examples are not going to be from these amazing graphics that sort of, or graffiti that I was really inspired by that from all over the world, but actually about work that we're doing in the Pitt Rivers Museum. So for those of you who've heard some of this before, I'm sorry. For those of you who've not, we're just a small institution. I'm very, you know, sort of realistic about that. We're not a big national institution, but I think we're doing work that sort of shows how we can all be part of that process of solidarity, of putting in our grain, putting in our work that can actually mobilize huge change and transformative change across different parts of the world. I'm Laura van Broekhoven, and I'm the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum. And we're sort of one of the things that we're trying to do. Many of you might not have people heard about the Pitt Rivers Museum before. You've probably been living close. Some of you may not have gone. I actually didn't even include this time a picture of the museum. I think of the inside of the museum. It's a very specific kind of space because it's sort of this Victorian age space, which is like very cramped to having 50,000 objects from all over the world on display in what looks like a maze, Victorian age maze cases. It's known and is being critiqued for being sort of this almost like the sort of the center of colonialism. It's where colonial officers of the British Empire were trained during empire, and all of our collections, many of our collections were gathered during colonial times. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this place. It also visually sort of can be quite repulsive for people to go into the museum, especially those that have suffered the violence of empire, will actually really sort of viscerally feel a sort of a problem going in, while others actually feel like it's their all-time favorite museum, and it reminds them of their grandfather's attic, or, you know, sort of there's all these sort of things that come together in that space. And I just want to talk about the sort of work that we've done around intersectionality in our programming, around addressing coloniality, and the ways that we've gone about sort of being part of this movement of solidarity and finding hope in the work by working with indigenous communities in particular, and our local communities in around Oxford. So if we look at the sort of globally at what are the big global risks landscapes and interconnectedness of those risks around the climate and biodiversity, energy and natural resources, health insecurities, debt, food and housing insecurity, the cybersecurity and crime. I think there's a number of elements, and that's the ones that I've put in blue, where as a Museum of Anthropology and World Archaeology, we can program towards, we have about 500,000 visitors, which is beautiful for an ethnographic museum. Most ethnographic museums struggle to find that many visitors. It's not huge compared to the Louvre or British Museum. But how can we program actually towards telling certain stories in the museum that actually help us to unpack some of those big issues, show ways that actually we can contribute to fighting some of the wealth disparities, democracy and impunity? How can we be part of sort of ensuring that we're celebrating or showing how democracy might be, ways forward, but is also problematic at times. So all of those kind of issues are the things that we're thinking around, looking at how can we play a role as a small museum, as a small player in the field, and so not be sort of so much discouraged by the fact that we inhabit this very colonial space, but how do we mobilize it by interrogating it, by using it as a tool to discuss some of these problems? Because many of these problems obviously are very crucial to the communities that we work with. They're very crucial to the communities that we work with because the collections of those communities are in our galleries. And so one of the things that is important to when your collections, like in the Weltmuseum Wien, but also the natural history and museums collections, they all come from these times when people were being exploited. And so Quijano's colonial power matrix, which many of you probably will have seen. This is a bit sort of my own interpretation of it, where there's a number of things that a colonizer does to colonize is around, so it's on the one hand grabbing power. So it's by disrupting the local and imposing the colonial power structures, right? So it's imposing political structures. It's making sure that the rule of law, the local rule of law, no longer exists, so they will impose their rule of law. It's a way of making sure that economic systems are being broken down, local economic systems, and the economic system of capitalism is the only one that actually works, and therefore it's the one that's being imposed on communities. It's gender and sex patterns, so the patriarchy, it's heteronormativity, those things are all being imposed through colonial systems, and very much sort of the ways that we've now come to see the world as the only possible of seeing a world, where around knowledge is very much Eurocentric epistemology. So epistemology is a way of knowing, Eurocentric ontologies, ways of being, so that there's only one way of being, one way of knowing that's valuable, that isn't irrational, that isn't just emotional, because for some reason we've all believed that our emotions and our thoughts are not connected. It's not just some reason, that's obviously during the lovely Renaissance, and also to make sure that actually we're thinking around that hierarchical thinking of what is the most important way of knowing, what is the most important knowledge carriers, who are knowledge bearers, who are knowledge keepers, what are the institutions where knowledge can be kept in academia. They don't sit in local communities, they do not sit with local shamans. The same around sort of killing other ways of knowing. Epistemicide is a big project for colonialism to actually say other ways of knowing. We have to actually, by taking, for example, as the Spanish did and lots of other colonizers after, making sure that the young generation was taken out of their homes and put into residential schools. They were being taught to no longer know the ways of knowing, no longer speak your own languages, and therefore not knowing your cultural embeddedness and belonging. Now, enlightenment, obviously, which then sort of, pictures this ratio versus emotions, and the exclusiveness of that. Some can have knowledge and others cannot. Around the culture and the self, so this is really sort of a colonial way of saying that some people are superior to others. And that's a very strong belief, where there's a lot of sort of self-discrimination, even that is sort of brought into communities. the oppression of your own body, of your culture, of just who you are, which obviously we see up until today, with sort of where whiteness is sort of celebrated and seen as the norm, where everybody tries to sort of achieve almost this whiteness, which then creates all kinds of stereotypes and to all kinds of prejudices. And then around nature, that nature can be owned. That's where capitalism, obviously, and extractivism is sort of the self-evidence almost of it, that humans are not integral part of nature, of this while we know the precarity of our earth, we know how so delicate that balance is, and also how important to us that when we go in nature, we get nurtured. We actually are able to be healed again. So many people feel that when they go into nature, they actually feel connected. And so instead of seeing nature as something that can be owned and extracted from, used for the consumption of humans, many communities obviously saw that very differently. And I think that's the sort of colonial elements that are put on top of societies, that we then sort of, by taking away objects that actually illustrated other ways of being, other ways of knowing, other ways of, other possibles, was also a way of making sure that others would no longer have those objects, to take away power and to accumulate it. And for many of our museums are full of those kind of objects. And that's also why a lot of communities are angry. They're upset that these objects are in our museums behind glass, in a context where they actually are taken from the lives that they had, and often just completely sort of devoid of the meanings that were in them. So in the case of the Pitt Rivers Museum, a lot of these sort of crises and a lot of that feeling of, why do you have our ancestors here? Why do you have these objects here? Leads to major protests on front of our doors. I'm sure that happens in lots of other places. Hundreds of people in front of the door during the Black Lives Matter protest, shouting, give it back, give it back, give it back, decolonize. So those were sort of the lots of demands from students. Obviously, we are in a university town, part of the University of Oxford. And we sort of, instead of saying, these are discussions that sort of are outside our doors, have nothing to do with us. I was part of the Black Lives Matter protests. I went also, I told them, I'm here. If you want to have a conversation, we can have a conversation. So we had a conversation on the lawn. This was obviously during COVID, when we were closed. But so a lot of the, so here, this is where the shouting of the give feedback was happening. There was lots of, I'm going to see if I can skip through this. And so lots of other discussions were about the status of Rhodes, Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes, who was a huge, sort of brain behind the whole apartheid system in South Africa. Was even so, I can't say delusional probably, but so vested in colonialism that he actually had a whole country named after himself. And a lot of students want things to change in places like Oxford. And I think that's what we're seeing, where this sort of intergenerational approaches are so important. And so for us, a lot of that work happens through teaching, it happens through teach-ins, and also around the Gaza Solidarity encampment. We had an encampment all along, which was saying we're on this long because Palestine is happening, and what's happening in Gaza is because of colonialism. And it's because of the people who were educated here in places like Oxford and Cambridge, where the Balfour Agreement was written, etc. So there's all these sort of connectedness, and students and people across the globe are seeing that interconnection in those intersections. And so for us, a lot of the work that we are doing is really about what kind of critical change work do we need to do, and how do we do that change. And so some of that change has been, I'll share some examples of how we're in the process of developing a praxis that is founded on these sort of pillars of thinking around intersectional programming, community engagement, and education, which is all intersectional. co-curation, co-collecting, obviously, epistemological equity, which I'll explain a little bit more, which means sort of where we, for a really long time, we have agreed that our epistemology, our way of knowing, of doing provenance research or documenting, is based on historical documents. And that's what we believe in strongly, that that's real way of knowing. Well, actually, we know that it's super fragmented. It's super biased. It's mostly written by elite white males. And it's not actually giving us a very full picture of the collections that we have. So if we look at equity, we try to sort of see what are those other ways of knowing? How have we not prioritized them at all? And is there ways to actually start rebalancing? Because we could see equality would be that they're all the same. But actually, maybe we should start listening harder to those other ways of knowing, just to sort of bring a bit more, sort of equity around how we're approaching some of our research, some of our conservation, some of our documentation. Cultural care is what I'll talk about a little bit more also, how we're looking at how can we move from preservation care, where objects need to be preserved the way they came in, but actually thinking about maybe there's other ways of thinking about objects. If they are living ancestors, if they are living beings, if they need care in a certain way, can we start listening to what kind of care they might need? Work around reconciliation, but also looking at our staff composition, as Jonathan Fine was also talking about, budget allocation, and developing a decolonial praxis. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around our sort of decoloniality work, but it's very much around acknowledging coloniality, undoing and unlearning, as Charles was talking about also, and actively making space for other possible. So that's very much the sort, for us, it's sort of a three-way process, let's say, that doing that work around the decolonial. And so letting go of our power, our control, and really looking at anti-racism at radical hope. How do we find different ways forward? So this intersectional programming over the years has been really sort of looking at how do we program around LGBTQIA+ with the LGBTQIA+ community, people living with disabilities, working with refugees, and also calling out a lot of the sort of hostile homeland politics of the British, working with forced migrants, which is a program called Multaka Oxford, a lot around also the precarity of our planet, but also working with communities who are really living under very difficult conditions, mostly always having the communities themselves be the curators, be the people who are actually bringing alongside our curatorial teams, bringing these stories on Tibet, for example, on Palestine, and also working with communities. I was very inspired by some of the work that was being told about yesterday, with people living with dementia. We have this project called Messy Realities, where we're working with those that are designing tools for the healthcare sector, where often people actually, they'll get all these little boxes to put their medicine in, or they'll have an alarm button, but it never gets used because it doesn't feel personal to them. It's not beautiful, it's actually really ugly. And actually, if they could be inspired by the sort of objects that we have, talismans, jewelry, people actually might feel that they could personalize things that feel personal to them and that they want to, and it fits with their system. So that's where we were working with the NHS and with lots of doctors. We work on Alzheimer, also Parkinson's. So we have a whole range of programs sort of working with carers and people living with long-term health issues. Then the other thing that we started, a lot of that was sort of programming, always partly happens behind the scenes and partly happens in special exhibitions, but then they disappear again. And in our permanent galleries, a lot was the same because it's all sort of grade 1 listed, and it's very difficult to actually see those differences in our permanent galleries. So we did an intervention in our permanent displays. And so I'm interested to know that the Weld Museum is saying that they shouldn't be hiding anything. For us, some of it was actually taking off display certain things. So it was about taking off display objects, especially human remains, and then curating their absence. Same goes for a lot of secret and sacred objects where people are actually saying these objects were never meant to be on display for everyone, for people who are not initiated. They should not be seeing them. Actually, they're going to harm them. And so often it comes from the communities. They're saying your visitors and your staff will be harmed by seeing these objects. We then obviously, the national press gets very upset when something is being sort of taken off display. But I think that's where, again, that sort of balancing of sort of who do we listen to? Why is it so important to some people to see the bodies of Black and brown people? Well, actually, they have no relationship to them. And I think that's sort of what, a lot of what we did was sort of to say, why don't we start looking at what is it that people are really so upset about? Where's the pain? Those people that are upset, and how many are they? And so we did a lot of research on that. I've spoken in the past about that, but I'm not going to focus on that now. But we very much also wanted to talk to the community, our visitors, and explain why we had taken off display, especially the shrunken heads, which is one of the things that people were very upset about, that they were taken off display. The work that we started doing when working with co-curators and communities, for example, with the LGBTQIA+ community, was so emotional to people and felt so emotional that we were getting so much feedback. So on the one hand, some of the work was around getting feedback where people were upset. And then we did quite a lot of research, because in the beginning, when I was seeing all the social media comments, I thought, because that's what you do, right? You look at the comments. And I thought, oh my God, we really upset the whole world. But then I had 3 students, one from Goldsmith, one from MIT, and one from Leiden, and one from our own team, look at what are the comments actually saying, and what is it that I'm not hearing? What are the voices I'm not hearing? And what it showed that actually 8% of people who were looking at it, and those were the ones that were very, very vicious in the comments, were negative. While 92% of the reactions were positive, as people leaving a heart or a thumbs up or a liking some of the posts that we were putting. It was 92%. 8%, and we then did a social network analysis and a sentiment analysis of the words. 8% were for people mostly, because you can leave as many comments as you want, but you can only leave one reaction. You can only like something once. You can't like it 10 times, apart from maybe in some media that I don't use and we didn't analyze. But it was really interesting to see, especially knowing how upset as museums we all are when we're getting negative feedback, because we're not very good at dealing with negative feedback. And so that was sort of where I thought, oh, this is really interesting. Also in the sort of some of the words that we were, when we were analyzing them, how closely they were sort of connected to coloniality, how closely they were connected to all those kind of assumptions around who communities were, what we were here to do, etc. So while when we were working with the community, like for example, with the LGBTQIA+ community, the heartfelt emotions that people were leaving us, and they got so enthusiastic that actually they started writing on all the walls of the exhibition, leaving us thousands of comments of people saying, this is the place where my kid felt so safe it could come out to me. So there were so many, and actually schools also who said, we find it really hard for teenagers to actually sign up to wanting to come on these cultural trips. But now we had to get an extra bus because you were discussing, sort of pronouns and gender identities, and just because it's really something that people are struggling with. So we can see how, sort of on the one hand, it gives us quite a lot of negative feedback on the one hand from across the UK, especially from certain newspapers, which makes the university quite nervous, because we're part of a university that is a little bit risk averse. But at the same time, the community's reactions from so many different places are really quite exciting. Then around cultural care, I just want to sort of talk a little bit about sort of some of those assumptions that we have in museums around how we care for objects. and which also come from certain ways of looking at objects, obviously. And a lot of that work we're developing with community curators, specialists, who are sort of leaders, indigenous leaders that we're working with. And I just want to sort of bring them in the room briefly. And we're sort of rethinking how collections care work, and this idea around the paradigm of preservation. That an object, when it comes into our museum, it needs to be conserved exactly the way it came in. And our paradigm is very much about keeping away pests and all the security risks and keeping people away from objects, and we're investing millions and millions in building these storage spaces. And there's this big problem that museums don't know how to deal with all these accumulated objects from all over the globe. And we're investing a lot in making sure that they're packed in ways that they will not be damaged, and damaged in our ways of thinking. Because when we start working with communities from across the globe, what they feel is good care, something entirely different than what we feel is good care. It's actually about touching. It's about bringing back to life. It's when Halipau, for example, saw one of the musical instruments, which is this tortoise shell, and she saw how cold it was, and she was sort of touching it and trying to see whether she could bring music coming out of it. She said, "You've killed it. You've let it die. Let me see if I can still resuscitate it." And she was so happy when she was able to do so by actually warming it up and just frothing it and making sure that the musical instruments was being brought back to life. The same with Captain Percy, who, for example, was really upset by the way that we had his calabash, sacred calabash, on display. It was on display with sort of, it was sort of on its head with sort of the calabash here, and then the feathers were just sort of hanging down, because that was what aesthetically looked nice. And yesterday someone was talking about this in Taiwan, I think, also as an example. And he was really upset and crying, actually, saying, "Yeah, but this is not this. You cannot do this to this object, because actually, the feathers are supposed to protect it. It needs to be hanging down. It's cracked. That's probably because the spirit that's in it needed to leave, because you're locking it up here." So there were all these sort of explanations of the materiality of the object and the way we had it on display that were just completely wrong in there. So they were really feeling that we were torturing these objects. We were really not taking care of it as we should be. With the olok, which is a really big feather headdress, ritual feather headdress, Captain Same, he had said from the beginning, and that's one of those things that museums struggle with. He had said, "I'm going to need to be able to spray water, I need to smoke, and I need to be able to be with the object." And obviously, as a museum, this was an object in the gallery, so sort of be able to smoke and spraying water. And so, yeah, we worked with our conservation team and our sort of facilities to make sure the smoke alarm is not going to go off. But he said, "Laura, if I would invite," because we had asked, what are the things we need to change? He said, "Laura, if you would come to my home, and I would not give you a place to sit, I would not talk to you, I would give you no food and no water, how long would you want to stay?" I said, "Yeah, well, not very long." They said, "That's the same with the olok. You have to sing it to it. You need to bring us to, to make sure that it actually is cared for properly, ritually, culturally. Because at the moment, it is really, it's suffering. It's having a hard time in this museum of yours." And so those were the things that we then needed to see with the museum, with our team. How do we accommodate it? And often there's, sort of ritual ways of doing this. There's ways of actually having, so it doesn't need to be that you really take it off and you put it to sleep every night. But there's sort of ways to do this metaphorically, or sort of through ways that you actually can agree with the community. This might be a way to do it. And so that's why we. And then there's Valdemar Kapor, who was very much sort of, this was in Musea Golgi in Emiliano Golgi in Pará. And he was very strong in sort of saying, "Please teach your children." They did not want objects back at all. They said, "We make all these objects still, but we do need you to tell your children to stop invading our lands, because we are people just like you. Can you please educate your children differently?" And so it was about, how can we tell that story around land grabs, around educating children in a different way was an important element. And so for us, instead of sort of prioritizing this preservation care, that we really put in a lot of money to put, and it's quite draining also from a sustainability. What we could say is that in a lot of the work that we do with communities, it's all about healing, societal healing. It's about healing of the relationship between the museum and the communities. It's healing in the society itself. There's also the well-being of ancestors and objects that is really important. There's the community and the family, sort of the well-being of the community, of the family sometimes needs objects not to be kept in these ways that we're keeping them, and also the museum and the staff, because people, all of the communities who we work with say this is also about you. It will help you. It will help your museum. It will ensure your staff is not going to get sick or depressed or having mental health struggles. And so that can help us to prioritize differently. What are the things that are really important apart from and people are often also very happy with the way things have been preserved. So it's not that they're saying you're entirely wrong, but now that you know better, can we work together to actually make sure that either objects need to be returned, they need to be put back into use, reconciliation ceremonies might need to happen, rituals, ceremonies need to be done, and access is really crucial. I don't know if I have time for this, but so I could give one example of how with the Maasai community, we've been working towards epistemological equity. So really looking at, okay, how can we actually look at these two different ways of knowing and actually say, if we put them on the same footing and prioritize the one that we've not prioritized before, what would that look like? And so this is Tamsin, are you happy for me to continue for another 5 minutes or so? So as an illustration of that sort of way of working, this is a project which started in 2017, so it's been going on for about 7 years, where Samuel Nangiria, who's an award-winning land rights and human rights activist of the Maasai, came to the Pitt Rivers Museum. And he sort of saw these, and we had agreed, he was there for an indigenous leadership program. We had agreed we would bring out some objects. And he immediately sort of said, like, Laura, I don't understand, what are these things doing here? And asking all these sort of questions about semantics also, saying, you say that they were collected, but these objects would never have been thrown on the floor, that you could just collect them from the floor and that no one was caring about them, because these are objects that will still be harming the families that they were taken from, because these are objects you would never, ever do away with. So he then sent me this video. He said, I'm going to go back to my elders, show me your strategic plan. And I showed this video and he said, yeah, this is all nice, but I'm not seeing anything about living cultures. And so the project is actually called the Maasai Living Cultures Project, because he said, even though our governments, Tanzanian government is not very nice to the Maasai, they would prefer for them not to be there so they could have more conservation plans and safari parks. He says, our governments would like us not to exist anymore, but we do not want to be put into a mortuarium. And our objects do not want to be put in these museums like a mortuarium where you're sort of being, sort of put as if we're dead, because we're very much alive. And I'm going to go back to my elders, talk to them and tell them that you have all these objects here in the UK. You've never reached out to us. Well, you know that we're still there. How is it that you didn't reach out to us? I said, okay, yeah. So he went back and sent me a video, because they were trained in participatory video making. So it's a very professional video. These 8 people sitting in sort of in a semicircle, telling me how annoyed they were that these objects are there, that these are sacred objects that we do not know the meaning of, and that clearly we need to, something needs to be done. And they want to talk to the administration to find a solution, a way forward. So I sent a video back inviting them to come with a delegation. They put together a delegation, and 2 delegations of 5 and 8 Maasai came, one in 2018, who identified 5 objects, which are the ones that are here, which were problematic because they're objects of inheritance. We had 188 objects in total, the rest was fine, but those 5 objects were the ones that really were problematic. And they said then, actually, we need spiritual guidance from our spiritual leader, from a Laibon. The Laibon are sort of healers and spiritual leaders of the community. They've always been really important. It's really well documented in when the British signed agreements with the Maasai, it was with the Laibons that they were signing agreements first, and then with the local leaders. And so the Laibon came with his sacred Enkidong, because that's their way of knowing. And the sacred Enkidong is a calabash full of little stones. And that with that calabash, he actually identified what the objects were, who they were taken from, how they were taken, when they were taken, and which families we had to reach out to tell them about these objects being here, and then identify what might be a way forward. We have done our research, provenance research. These are objects that have never been on display. They've never been researched before. But we've done research into what we could find around provenance, which was, quite partial. We also went to Cambridge, where they also identified 5 of these objects. And the only information that was with the objects in Cambridge was a little label with a question mark. Well, for the Maasai, that was really problematic seeing that, because to them, these were orkatas, which is the bracelets that actually a son gets from his father on his deathbed. So he's really sort of it's like seeing a body being put on the table. And sort of for that to be so, casual and callous in how we deal with these objects was really, really emotional. They had to stop the visit. They just actually said, we have to stop now. And but then, luckily Nick Thomas and his team at Cambridge also were able to sort of say, yeah, we apologize for not having reached out earlier. We can't apologize for the British Empire because we're not even national museums. But when we were, so this is a picture that I took because it sort of felt like a really important moment where we were bringing our historical research on provenance together at the table, and we had just had these readings from the Laibon, and what we were seeing is actually quite a lot of congruence, because they were important. The moments and the places where they were saying they were taken, kind of, there was a coin, they sort of like, actually it's not that far apart. It's actually quite interesting to see how they connected. They then went back home and talked to Mokombo, and so he, in 2021, this was obviously during a very difficult time for everyone because it was COVID, but also Kenya and Tanzania had a completely different approach to COVID. So they were quite split off from each other. Normally they can pass the borders. But Mokombo sort of said, that he'd been instructed before, and now that my nation shouldn't be subjected to more violence, I will not be ready to lead my nation into further conflict. So he said, this needs to be a peaceful approach. There were lots of communities that were consulted in, because that's when the delegates would go back. They would go and do lots of consultation with Maasai nations and some of what they call the elites, so lots of lawyers, and so they were saying you have to sue the museum, and we're going to so take a really conflictuous approach. But Mokombo said, no, this needs to be about healing and it needs to be about peace, and that's really important for this project, and everyone accepted that, as that was going to be the approach. He also said that engaging deeply in this process will be about healing most of the wounds of colonialism, and above all, bring back peace. And then he said, and if they, the museums and the UK families, because we were asked to identify the UK families who were involved in the taking, are not ready, then don't disturb my people by refreshing their memorable. So if you're not going to do what we're saying that you have to do, then please just don't bother us, because then we're not going to engage with the process further. And then he had identified that what needed to happen were the Elata Oingiro ceremony, which is when one Maasai kills another Maasai. There's a ceremony that can be done to actually re-establish the relationship. So this was not about our terms of reconciliation and bringing back the objects. That was not at that moment what they needed to be done. There needed to be a pilgrimage that needed to go to all the different families across Maasai land, so in Kenya and Tanzania, telling them with the Laibon there that these objects had been taken and had been found. So to them, their mothers and fathers that have been found. And that's a really stressful process. But then they could say, in the Elato Ingiro ceremony, what was a bit difficult for me to sort of, one, selling this to the university, and then that we were allowed to participate in it, but also to find a donor. Because the part of the process of the ceremonies is that there needs to be 49 cows per family, so 250 cows more or less in total, had to be given to the different families and brought there and then sort of handed over in a ceremony. So we've been really lucky to having an amazing donor. So the Staples Trust, it was Jessica Frankopan who's been very involved. So she's one of the Sainsbury families, and she agreed. So I could say to Mokombo, yes, we are going to go ahead with this. And so last summer we went there. We had huge ceremonies with thousands of Maasai there. So there was parts of establishing a new fire. That's always the beginning of a relationship building. There was parts of being welcomed in the community with thousands of women and men who were welcoming us in each community. Then in silence, I had to herd the cows, and I was a bit nervous about that because I've never herded a cow before. But we didn't lose the cows, and luckily there were Maasai warriors and family members who were helping us. And then there was a sort of ritual handover, and here you can see sort of us on the one side, on the sort of back, and in the other side there's the family, and there was sort of the cows would then go to the family and be handed over, and then sort of corralled. And parts of the ceremony were then sort of done. There was a ritual breaking of the fast, and then sitting with the family and talking. And here again, very different provenance information came about the object. So there was the provenance information that the Leibon gave. There's the provenance information that we have from our historical records. And then there was what the families remembered of how the objects were taken, which was completely different in some cases, and in other cases it was similar. So it was really interesting to sort of know that all these memories and how memory is sort of, constructed is sort of in different places was completely different. Then there was a ceremonial part where so some of the governors were there. They flew in with helicopters, thousands of people, lots of popular Maasai singers were brought in. So there was a real intergenerational coming together, and also actually lots of different faiths were brought together. That's too much to explain, but it's and for example, one of the very famous Maasai singers, I don't think we can hear the audio, but he sort of made songs and then invited people to come to the ceremonies, and so he's quite a famous person. And so we were, I must say, blown away by the magnitude of what was happening and how big the ceremonies were. Out of these 5 objects and this moment of encounter in the museum, and then the engagement and the amount of work that was done by our Maasai partners was just phenomenal. And then the last bit, which I think is just again around hope and solidarity, is where one of the things that Mokombo also had said, and where Sam, who's Samuel Nangeria, who's the project leader from the Maasai, has put in an incredible amount of work, is that one of the things Mokombo said is, if this is really going to lead to transformational healing for my community, we need to reestablish the Orkiama. And the Orkiama is the council of traditional leaders of all the Maasai, which used to exist until 1919, until the British said that it could no longer exist. And so it was abolished because it was a transnational Kenyan and Tanzanian sort of council. And so what they did is they actually said, because I said to Sam, because we had a lot of risk assessments we had to do, etc. And so I needed to know how upset because we were only working with 5 families and 5 sections. How upset are the other 20 sections going to be that they're not getting, these cows are like generational wealth. So it's important for a family and a section to get this to be included. But he said, actually, and I said, there's 2.1 million Maasai. Suppose we're not meeting with 2.1 million Maasai. Who are we exactly meeting with so I can put it in the risk assessment? And he said, well, Laura, I've been going to all the section leaders and we've been reestablishing the Orkiama, which means that actually you are going to be meeting with representatives of the 2.1 million Maasai. And apart from that, what we've also agreed is that we're not just going to have the Orkiama be consistent of males only, because the Maasai are horribly misogynistic against women. But we've made sure that actually the Orkiama will be consisted of 50 people now, which will be male and women, because we feel that because they're these objects were all made by women, and it's only thanks to their existence that we're now all coming back together. Culture is actually bringing us back together now, and this is where and the women were incredible. As the speeches they were given were incredible, and so now we actually have the 2 members of the Orkiama, the 5 family members. In a week and a half, they'll be in Oxford together with the project leaders, so 10 Maasai, a women-led delegation. They're almost all women, apart from the 2 objects that were male objects. And so I think that's where, for me, this idea of solidarity goes, sort of in where what sort of Leah Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor say, without a doubt, building bridges of solidarity requires patience. It's much easier to draw lines, to pass judgment, to point fingers and place blame. But the reality is none of us are perfectly pure or enlightened. We're all implicated to varying degrees in oppressive systems, and hopefully we evolve as we learn. One way to fight a profit-driven system that treats people as disposable is to instead treat people as redeemable. Solidarity means not writing anyone off completely, not throwing anyone away. It holds out hope that systems and individuals can change. And I think that's where, to me, it sort of makes me think around the redeemability of the museum, the redeemability of sort of all of us as colonial actors and all of us as individuals, and how do we work alongside each other towards sort of hope and possibilities instead of constant limitations and impossibilities. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Lara. Now you see why 17 years ago we didn't want to define the inclusive museum. All kinds of possibilities, the hope, and how we can all work together. And thank you for the fantastic presentation. Any questions? We've got 10 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, very enlightening. And I was just wondering, in thinking about the power matrix, how are you grappling with the display typology of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which organizes the artifacts by a type or subject, and has been connected to social evolutionary thought in the past as well? And I know that you have kind of defined it as a democracy of things. And I'm wondering how you conceive of this reframing as a tool to reflect on the politics of display, and like how you think this could engage with intersectional programming and praxis, as well as the notion of objects as living things.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, for that question. So it's clearly a problem, and we're actually just at the start of a 10-year plan to start making changes to the museum. This will not mean that a lot of those, because a lot of people get very nervous when we talk about changing the Pitt Rivers Museum, because it's also extremely, a unique factor of it is the way that the display works. We're lucky that we got some funding from the John Ellerman to actually start bringing in curators from across the globe, indigenous curators, to start thinking with us. We've obviously have all the connections with LGBTQIA+, through Multaka with refugee communities. We work a lot with people living with dementia, kids who are being excluded from school. So we're bringing all of those knowledges together in one room, and then looking at how can we change the assemblages in the museum. I must say that the framework within which I'm asking indigenous communities to think is not one that they usually engage with, because they usually say, I can only talk about my community. I do not talk about others. But so what we're inviting indigenous curators to do is to say, can we think about things that bind us and bind the problems that we're all facing from a sort of point of solidarity. And at the moment, people are quite excited about that, actually. So it's not just that we have to think about, we work with the Evenki, for example, in Siberia, and he said, so this is Alexander Haratnov, so he said, where we come together to share stories and to sort of build our experiences and be together for a shared stories around the campfire. And to me, your museum is like our campfire. All these people come together, they use it as a meeting point, as a place where we're actually gathering thoughts, and so it's a gathering space. And I think that is a really beautiful sort of thought of sort of saying, how can we look at it as a gathering space of thoughts and thinking together and finding solutions which include almost all of us, if possible.
My question, and thank you for your presentation. My question has a specific interest in curating the emptiness. And I want to ask, because you showed us so many excellent images and videos from your project, could that be a future exhibition to take the place of the emptiness and showcase how getting those artifacts back where they belong can actually become a new content for museums? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, because there's this often when people feel anxiety around this kind of work, is that they feel a sense of loss. And actually, from when we start talking about it, and also usually there's objects being given to the museum, more objects than are being asked to be returned. And so in that sense, that gives us these opportunities to tell these stories of healing, of reconnection, and actually of self-representation, right? And actually self-determination. These are the objects that we want you to, to tell these and these stories. One of the things I would say, what is it that you say about us? And then, people, because often education team, they have to talk about all cultures in the world. And they said, yeah, well, this and this, and what are the objects you're using? And then they said, can we talk for ourselves? We're going to make videos. We're going to make new objects for you. We'll document how we make them so that you can actually tell the story the way we feel comfortable, and that is truthful and not full of nonsense and lies.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Maria. I have a question. Well, your talk was wonderful. I was very moved around building relationships with these communities that have been mistreated, misrepresented in a way that really communicates the authenticity of the effort. I've heard from grant applications and fellow museum workers trying to do this work, and it's perceived by outside community, even the community that's not being engaged, as being performative. So a question I have in terms of how do you handle that, if that's something that you've struggled with, creating authentic connections and struggling with the perception that they may be performative by other museum staff or by donors. So that's my question.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And it certainly is, getting funding for this kind of work is really hard. Making sure that it's not performative or tokenistic or just co-opting certain things is also really difficult, and something where you need to keep yourself in check constantly. I think for us, it's really about building trust. And, coming back to what we were talking about earlier is where, obviously for the Maasai, if Sam were here, but because of visa reasons, that would not be possible to just have him also come here. But he would say it was really hard for him to have people trust us. No, they must be lying. They're the British, they're a museum. They're not really going to engage with our ceremony. So it's really about doing the work, I suppose. But yeah, getting the funding to do the work is where you need some funding to, and that's where a lot of what I did is to start, because in the beginning, a lot of staff were, first they were very hesitant to sort of engage, and people go, this is not going to happen, or questioning and decolonizing, what does that mean, and then Googling it. And it's, a lot of it is about building practice and process, right? So, and people were also quite anxious about, can we trust people? There's moments where you think, am I going crazy now to sort of, and there was actually quite nice to see how in Berlin, completely separate from what we were doing, there's this project being developed by a Maasai researcher who was finding exactly the same reactions from the community. And he had made a film also, so someone then connected us, and I thought, oh wow, this is so nice to actually see that we're not losing our minds, you know, because there are moments that you think, especially, you know, when people, there's some emeritus professors who are not very enthusiastic about the work and think that I'm crazy. And as a woman, a European woman, on top of a Belgian woman, you know, sort of I'm just, you know, leading the Pitt Rivers Museum into the most horrible, you know, sort of paths of destruction. So I think there's, what I've found is academically, it's really hard to get this kind of funding because it's such an open-ended process. You don't know where it goes, that actually academically it's difficult to find funding, but some of my other academic colleagues have been able to do so. And then I think, yeah, it's about trust building on both sides, both with our funders. So we've had some amazing funders, and also trying to do some crowdfunding. So having different stakeholders give us money because they're really enthusiastic about this idea of healing, this idea of reconnecting and redeemability.
We have time for probably one more question if you have one. Anyway, I can't see you if you're waving at me. Maybe we'll just wrap it up.
Is someone here? Ashley?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see you then.
So the part that resonated best with me was when you were talking about restructuring the sort of education that they wanted from the museum and the sort of narrative that they wanted the museum to tell. What would that look like in terms of educational programming and guided tours at the museum?
Yeah, so what our education team did is actually during the pandemic, because they came just in 2020, just before the pandemic started, and that's when this wish was being sort of expressed. We then fundraised to have some money to, and that was a whole process actually of one of our team who's from the research team, who then became part of the education team, to start interrogating a lot of coloniality that's in the education program, which was hard. Because it's, you know, and I know that from when I was in the Netherlands, we were working with our education team, it was hard because they're so focused on delivery and they know the curriculum really well. And so what, for example, our secondary schools officer, what she started to do is to first work with teachers, also work with, you know, apart from the work that we were doing with the Maasai, where we had said, okay, yes, we're happy for you to make the videos. And then there's a lot of talks happening about what are those videos going to be about and who are going to make them and what are the topics that we could address and how do we work that into curriculum. There was also the side on how do we then, people still wanting to come for these sessions, which are not on the dwellings of the Maasai, which is sort of where, you know, it sort of fits in the curriculum, because that's the way people like to talk about how do you live in the desert, or how, you know. So, but then started to work with the exam schools for really secondary education and A-levels, and really trying to see whether exam questions could change and become less colonial. Extremely colonial in the UK. I don't know if you are from the UK, but my two teenagers, you know, the sort of questions that were being set, and the only possible, like, for example, was the British Empire an accidental empire? When I looked at the literature they were given, the only question that they could give was yes. Well, actually, that's not true, obviously. But I think that's sort of where we're trying to see how can we actually be part of that systemic change, where we're actually working with the teachers, working with the schools, working with the exam schools. And we're a tiny, you know, museum. We have 32 FTEs, so it's very small. But, you know, where we can, and then obviously we are part of the University of Oxford, which is very big. And so to work with departments, to work with researchers, to work with sort of people who are developing. So that's kind of how we've not just on, so we didn't just focus on the Maasai, yes, for the objects and the videos, etc., but more broadly, really looking at our own, what are we putting out there and how can we change that? And it is still hard, because my education team, we have one of them who sort of, you know, does a lot of primary school. She says, I don't know if I'm doing it right. I think I'm doing it wrong. And you're going to be angry. And then we sort of need to keep that conversation in the team going. And, you know, there's no way of doing this, you know, sort of right. There is a way of doing it wrong, though. So how do we make sure that we are doing it better? So I guess that's the sort of, accepting it as a process that's going to take time, and that we're all on a different, sort of part of that journey also, that we're not expecting perfection. So I think, yeah, that's how we kind of approached it.
Thanks, Laura. I just want to make a quick comment. You mentioned authentic connections. Connections and relationships are fluid in the way museums engage. And this has become an issue within UNESCO ICOM circles. So there is a code of ethics on how you deal with relationships in museums and dealing with heritage and connections. It's called Code of Ethics under the UNESCO 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention. They were deliberately drafted because there's no such thing as authentic. They're only fluid. It's up to you. You can just Google UNESCO 2005 Convention Code of Ethics, 2003 Code of Ethics. Thank you very much. Once again, would you join me in thanking Laura?
Now we're heading off to parallel sessions before lunch. So find where you're going. Let me know if you're lost. I'm gonna look at stuff out of quiet first. Oh, no, it's okay. I just don't like everything.